Welcome to the Act React podcast, where we have conversations about improvisation with remarkable artists. I'm the host, Daniel Burkholder, a dance artist based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm truly excited to share with you today's conversation with Sharna Fabiano. I have known Sharna since we both lived in the Washington, D.C. area, but this is true. This is like the first time we've really sat down and talked about improvisation, our artistic practices, and kind of how that all translates into our lives. Yeah. So, a little bit about Sharna. Sharna Fabiano is an Argentine tango dancer turned professional development coach and author of Lead and Follow, The Dance of Inspired Teamwork. After teaching and performing dance for nearly 20 years, she now designs experiential team development programs for organizations and coaches individuals through a wide range of career challenges. Her improvisational practice currently takes shape most often in her home painting studio in Long Beach, California. Well, I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Enjoy. Well, hi, Sharna. Thank you so much for joining me on the Act React podcast.
You are so welcome. It is an honor and pleasure to be here.
Yeah, as we kind of were just talking about a moment ago, just we've kind of known of each other for quite a while, but we've never had real time to really kind of dig in and have kind of extensive conversations. So I'm excited that maybe this will be the first of many conversations we're able to have.
Likewise, I feel the same way. It's one of these sort of secret surprises of our pandemic era. We get to make these wonderful, unexpected connections.
Yeah, great. So this is the question or a variation of the question I always start with is just like, how does improvisation show up, manifest itself in your life these days?
You know, I think right now it's manifesting itself the most in my visual art practice. I, as you know, started out as a dancer, but particularly spending so much time at home, I really use that time to bring myself into the present and to kind of put into practice all those wonderful life-giving principles of improvisation, that I think feed us.
Yeah. So how does that, so just kind of dig in that for a moment, how does that kind of actually play out in your practice? Like when you sit down or go into your space to do that practice, what happens? What does that look like for you?
Sure. I want to give a quick shout out to my painting teacher, Flora Bowley in Portland, Oregon, who is the really master of teaching this sort of method. She calls brave intuitive painting. And I learned a lot about how to translate my dance improvisation skills into visual art from her. So for me, what that looks like is, first of all, I think a lot of creatives will relate to the hesitance of like moving out of your everyday life into the improvisation space. So first it's just like really schedule myself time to go there. And I focus on getting there, right? Which I think is for me like the first experience of improvisation that's important to me is I just be there. I just like put myself in the studio and I don't attach to what I'm going to do there necessarily, or, even like what kind of materials or projects I'm going to work on. I just focus on my commitment to being there in that space in my house. And that, that itself is powerful for me because it moves me out of the normal way of thinking of like, okay, to-do list and like now what's happening tomorrow and planning. So I just show up there in my space and, I have all my tools there, my paints and my pencils and my paper and my canvases. And it's important for me not to be attached to the outcome because that starts me like worrying and, it's not the kind of frame I want to be in. Yeah. So I go there and it sounds funny to say, but I just like commit to being in the studio for a period of time and then to see what happens. And, once I'm there, then things happen. And then I think for me, what I describe as the improvisational approach to visual art is to start with something simple that I'm interested in, like I'm really drawn right now to working with these watercolor pencils and the effect that they have on the paper when you sort of blur them with water. I'm like, okay, I'm really attracted to that effect. And so let me just start by exploring that. And then from that, once I take that one step, then I get to react to what happened. Okay, I see how it's flowing, how the marks are feeling and spreading on the paper. Then maybe I will do something else, like take a graphite pencil, or maybe I'll draw, some shapes, or maybe I'll combine that with some acrylics. Like I like working with mixed media. So I really do like one thing at a time. And I find that is what brings me into that present moment state of improvising and not knowing what's coming, but discovering what's coming, and then just constantly getting to respond to the step before.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I kind of relate to the idea of like, you're making something, right? You're going to have something that you've made, and at some point you'll end and you'll be able to say, oh, I'm done with this.
Yeah.
In theory, at least, I guess, right? Or at least I'm done with this right now. But without the idea of like, what is the whole thing going to manifest as? And I think about that, like when I'm performing dance improvisation, like I know I'm going to be in front of people and they're going to be watching me. And usually I know at least like, oh, it should be around this length. But often that's kind of what I know. And it's just that idea of one thing and, oh, this is happening. And now this next thing is happening. And it's like this unfolding kind of in time. And I had written, or not written, but I have a little quote from your book that we'll talk about this in a little bit, but sure. And I meant to like, this was totally on my mind to bring up later, but kind of what you just said made me think of this. So I'm going to read some of your words back to you for a moment, if that's not too weird. And
no, go for it. It's a funny experience.
It does respond. It does talk about dance, right? Because in that context, but you wrote, to a dancer, improvisation does not mean winging it or making it up as you go along. Rather, it implies a highly refined system of communication built through specific methods of training. And I really appreciate that. Just, being in the dance improvisation field for so long, people not understanding exactly what we're doing and thinking we are just kind of winging it and it just doesn't take anything. But you also kind of just talk about that in your studio art practice right now of, obviously you have experience with these different mediums and then you're kind of playing with them, but from this base of understanding them to a certain degree, even while you're still discovering more about them, it's not just throwing whatever. It's like, there's techniques and history on how to build that thing.
Absolutely. Very well said. And I think right now I'm still, in the kind of early stage of my art exploration. So my training is less than it was in dance, but very much the same, the same principles apply. And the more I learn, when I take a workshop or right now I'm taking a lot of online art courses and observing other artists, then like, oh, now I understand maybe this handful of things I could try with a charcoal, right? And I'll explore all those techniques, and then that then comes into, the improvisation process.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe we can do kind of shift and think about dance a little bit, because that is so much of your history, and you say so many kind of really engaging things about, especially tango, and that's a form that I'm not familiar with, other than being a spectator at times and having seen you do it at least a couple times. And I think to start off, again, you mentioned how tango is fundamentally an improvisational form, and like there's some value of this idea of not knowing what's happening next, and it's kind of evolving, again, doing one thing and then the next and the next. But one of the things that, like, I guess I didn't know and that I find super intriguing is the idea that tango doesn't have a basic step. And like, I think about I've taken I don't know how many salsa, introductory salsa classes, and every single salsa introductory class, you start with the same thing, right? Because it's that foundation, or learning the ballroom, the box, whatever that thing. I remember I remember doing ballroom when I was 9 years old. My parents used to compete ballroom dancing, and so they put my sister and I in classes, and that's my first image of doing this how to do the box, right?
Yeah.
And so these basic steps. But could you like so how do like in Tango, how do you start like without that basic step of getting people to start doing the thing? Could you
Mhm.
just talk about like how you introduce people to that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the most distinctive characters, I think, of the dance, which is, what made it so intriguing to me, because I also went through that pathway of learning other partner dances first. And I would say it's very much related to the music and the relationship between tango dance and music. So when we say basic step in a salsa or a swing or what have you, the basic step is tied to a specific rhythm pattern, right? So it is quick, quick, slow, or in a waltz, it would be like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or whatever it is. So it's tied to a rhythm, which is characterizing that particular form of music. But in the case of tango, dancers don't dance to one rhythm pattern. They dance to anything. It's a form in which you can pause whenever you want. You can dance on any of the rhythms that are being played. You can dance on the phrasing of the music. There's many different ways that dancers interpret the music with their movement. And so for that reason, maybe other reasons as well, but this is one reason that we say there's no basic step, in the sense that there isn't a combination of movements that go with a repeating rhythm.
I see.
Like there are in other dances.
Yeah.
And so that means at the beginning, what often you learn is just to move on a downbeat on the main tempo of the song. There are lots of ways to begin. That's not, the only one, but very commonly that's how you begin, and how to sync up with a partner on that regular tempo. And then right from the beginning, you're talking about leading and following, which is how tango dancers describe improvisation, right? That's how they talk about it. So the leader person is tasked with deciding, when we step, what the rhythms are that we're going to step on, what order the combinations of footwork go in. And there are a couple of I would say they're not like basic steps, but there are a couple of patterns that are part of the grammar of tango that everyone learns as common vocabulary. So the leader person is then saying, okay, we're going to use that pattern, we're going to use this one, we're going to split it in half or combine it with that other one. So the leader is like the choreographer of the couple, you could say. And then the follower person, is tasked with being able to enact those decisions one at a time, like one weight change at a time. So you're always on one foot, you're always like ready for what may be coming next. It's usually forward, backwards, or sideways. Occasionally pause, occasionally swivel, but your body sort of is trained to perform in that like single moment, one movement at a time order. It's in a nutshell. I think that's how we talk about improvisation. And so, the absence of the basic step makes those skills essential at the beginning.
Right. So the listening to one another is kind of the foundation. I mean, that's obviously true in other kinds of partner dancing as well, but certainly, I've danced with people and we've been doing the basic steps, and that's real. That's like we're barely listening to one another because we're just trying to concentrate on like which foot to step on and stuff like that. Right. There's that
you can sort of get
time to get.
I would say you can kind of get away with not listening for snatches of time, maybe in other dances, and then, we'll just come back together on the next like ball change or whatever. There's a little bit more flexibility or wiggle room. Whereas with the tango, if you stop listening for a moment, then it's just literally the next step doesn't happen.
Right.
Because your follower is, the job of the follower person is to not move until there's a clear, indication. And there's, again, a little bit of, flexibility there as you work together, but that's essentially the idea.
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess the one kind of partner dancing that I do have a lot of experience with, of course, is contact improvisation, which is very much, I think, in some ways very similar in that we sometimes use vocabulary to teach certain concepts, but the idea is not to learn a set of vocabulary. It's really the focal point is really listening to one another and playing with that idea of how sensitive you can be to those kind of minute shifts and changes. right? In
Mhm.
pressure, in tension, and release, and weight, and all those kind of lead you through the dance, as opposed to executing steps, as it were.
Yes, absolutely. And I think tango dancers would use a lot of that same language to describe their relationship with their partner. It's
Mhm.
just that tango has a set of constraints. You have to be vertical, you have to go
Yeah,
around a room. You
yeah,
know, it has your upper bodies don't move out of their position, more or less. So it has a different set of constraints
yeah.
than the contact improv. But yeah, the sensation of listening and changing tone and pressure, that sort of thing. A lot of the same training, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one thing that you also kind of talk about is bring up this idea of connection and
Mhm.
relationship. And that was really, I mean, you even talked about how when you first started doing tango, you were in Boston, and that whole history of like going to do different social dances as way of meeting people, and just realizing that that connection, um, in tango is so deeply important, in terms of development. And this idea of choosing, also you bring up, of choosing, like choosing how to dance, choosing your dance partner, of course, whether it's even just on a
Mhm.
simple fact of saying yes or no to someone if they want to
Yeah.
dance, right? But this idea of choice within this context is, I don't know if there's anything more for you to say about that, but I find it a really, it's probably something really important, this idea of choice.
For me, it was very much so. And, I discovered tango as right out of college. So it was my early 20s. And you know, I think I was still discovering what relationship was, as a human concept and sort of how I wanted to be in the world with other people. So yeah, for me, it really became kind of like a laboratory for um, understanding like who I was with other people and how my relationships with other people then influenced my own sense of myself. And
Mm.
connection, I think in tango comes a lot from this need to be sensitive to the other in order to improvise on such a precise level, right? When you use your body in that way, you kind of open yourself to a lot of sensation, a lot of shared information, and so there's an intimacy there that I would call it like a human intimacy,
Mhm.
not necessarily a romantic one.
Sure.
And that teaches you a lot about yourself, how you respond to that sort of practice. And then that's where the choice comes in, I think. And this for me sometimes resonates a little with my experience of contact improv, where there's a very active discussion of boundaries and
Yeah.
personal safety and so forth. So yeah, in the tango world, there's a number of choices, right? As you said, first is just who do I want to partner with? Who do I want to be close to? And I get to choose that, right? There's a great lesson there, I think, for all of us in choosing who we share our space with and our body with. And then also choosing like, how do I want to embody this role? Like whether I'm on the leader side or the follower side, what does that even mean to me to be in partnership? Um, Following someone, do I enter that like meekly, sort of focusing on my obedience, and where do I get that pattern from? Do same thing on the leader side. Do I approach that with hesitation, or do I approach that with creativity? Or am I comfortable directing someone else, or am I not? Am I comfortable trusting someone else, supporting them, as a follower? Or is that hard for me? All those lessons I think come into play. And for me, it was a very rich territory.
Yeah, no, that sounds really rich. And you kind of mentioned this as this the idea of the leader role and the follower role,
Mhm.
and just mentioning that, I don't know if this is true in other parts of partner dancing and social dancing, but in tango, this definitely moved towards not thinking of the male role or the female role, but the leader role and the follower role, and that people can kind of play with which role they're in, and in different dances choosing, different roles. And so, just, I mean, I don't know if there's, um, how does that manifest? Like when you're out dancing, is that pretty mutable, or that changes depending on what community you're in? Like how does that, kind of, how is that in the world going out into like social settings and stuff like that?
Yeah. Important question. I think I'm not super involved right now, in
Yeah,
Tango,
sure.
but I would say with confidence that probably there's still a larger percentage of men identified people who prefer to lead, a larger percentage of women identified people prefer to follow, which is
Yeah.
totally fine.
Yeah.
It has changed over the past my 20 years of involvement in Tango. I was someone who was always very enthusiastic about dancing both roles
Yeah.
and making that available educationally for anyone who wanted to. So I have seen a lot of development there, a lot of more fluidity, more comfort with people choosing different roles or switching.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would definitely say it depends on the community, who's heading up that community, what their interests are.
Yeah.
So in some studios, the teacher organizer is interested in sharing different roles or in teaching different roles, and so a lot of people in that community would be drawn to it and do that, and then others are not. So there's definitely a spectrum out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, having read that, I'm just going to reflect on my experience with contact improvisation, where even leader and follower are that's a little controversial, even to like label people in those roles, let alone kind of genderize them. And yeah, I've always thought when I've done different kinds of partner dance, I was like, wonder what if we could switch back and forth between these two roles, like spontaneously, continuously throughout the dance, like, moment to moment, who's leading and who following, like allowing that to be morphed a little bit. Just wonder how that would kind of open things up, change things, disrupt things, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I will say that within the Tango experience, and we use those terms leader follower to, in a practical sense, because we're on a dance floor, it has to go around counterclockwise, and there's some logistical things. There needs to be someone like the leader who navigates that. However, once you're actually moving with someone, it is not so clear cut in the physical experience of it. And I think it's hard to appreciate that unless you're inside it. So you might, I might show up and I'm calling myself the follower in this partnership, but, in the act of dancing, things like, it is possible for me to make a sort of decision, in a certain moment that would influence my partner. Likewise, my leader partner, who's officially the leader in charge of protecting us from crashing, obviously it's possible for that person to listen to what I'm doing with my body, make a decision based on that. So, there it starts to feel like, okay, these roles are not so rigid. We have them as scaffolding because that's logistically we need them for this form. But if we tried to make them like super rigid, the dance probably wouldn't work very well. So there has to be a little bit of that blending as we get going.
Yeah. I think in one of the other interviews I listened to, you talked about the shared tango body, that idea.
Yeah.
And that again, that idea just resonated with me. Yes, that kind of moment of where all of those roles kind of blend, and it's like the two is really one kind of nervous system in a way. And yes, it's responding to itself in a way, as opposed to one responding to the other or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it in my experience of contact improvisation, that feels like a stronger experience. Like I have that in a more overt way. One of my contact teachers used to say it's like two followers following the dance, but it does also happen within tango. And I've had people say things like, oh, how did you know to do that? Or it just happened. I don't know. I didn't make a conscious decision on that. It just seemed like the right thing to do. So that definitely does happen. And that magic of the shared nervous system, where you don't know how but that's definitely it exists for sure.
I want to kind of talk about this other work that you're doing and stuff like that, but I think I've just like one more question specifically around tango, and maybe I'm gonna like blur a couple questions together, so this may be a complicated question. I'll see if I can make it straightforward. So I had a thought about like wanting to kind of ask about the difference between performing or dancing with someone for the first time and dancing with someone for the 500th time, right?
Mhm.
Like those differences. And because to me that there's some really rich in, say, improvisationally or relationship wise in both those contexts, in both those situations.
Mhm.
And then the other thing I'm curious about the differences, like I keep saying performing because I'm thinking of the difference between being at like just a social event where you're going on and off the dance floor, and other times when you've performed tango on the stage,
Mhm.
or as a demonstration, or where it's clear like, oh, people are watching Sharna as a dancer, and you know, like this is a
Yeah.
more than just your personal enjoyment or something. So I don't
Mhm.
know. Those seems maybe two questions that don't fit together so well, but I don't know, anything in there that resonates with you or
Yeah, I mean, the difference that feels the biggest to me is the social versus the performance space.
yeah.
That the first thing I think of is the performance is so much harder, because there's suddenly this other variable of the audience, um, and including that. So in a typical social dance evening, like there's tons of mistakes, what we call quote mistakes, and the skilled improviser, or the what we would hope to do as a social improviser is to just weave those into the dance and like keep going, right? So you're not so concerned about the visual aspect of what you're doing. Whereas, in a performance, the visual aspect becomes more important, at least from my point of view.
Yeah.
And so those quote like mistakes or unpredictable things have like greater weight, I think, and that's why I kind of think of it as maybe harder. And because the tango form is restricted in a certain way, right? Then there's some limitations in terms of how you can respond to things that happen in unpredictable fashion.
Right.
So that sort of brings me to the second part of your question, like a new person versus a familiar person. I've had social experiences with both of those, and also performative experiences with both of those. And
Okay.
by far the most terrifying is the performance with a new partner.
Yeah.
And I think not surprisingly, those are not my favorite memories of performance. Although, they were interesting, but I wouldn't call them like the most successful. Whereas like the new partner in a social arena is just the stakes are lower, right? Yeah. So I've had sometimes really delightful social experiences with total strangers, which, is kind of a thrill because you never know how that's going to go. But again, because the stakes are lower, it just feels like there's less urgency around it, or less pressure around it. I think the advantage or the benefit of dancing with a familiar partner, particularly in performance, is that not that you are less spontaneous, but that you have created together like a kind of dance within the dance, perhaps. Even if you're still improvising, you like one example is the most recent partner that I worked with, before I semi-retired, took my sabbatical. When I danced with him, there's a layer of tango movement that's called decoration, which is not something that's led or followed, but something that you sort of add on top. Spontaneously to kind of accent the music. And so I had a whole repertoire of adornments, we would call them embellishments, that would only occur when I danced with this partner, just because of the way he put together movements. Mm-hmm. And so that, that kind of is a comfort in a way, because not that we're doing things by rote, but that we kind of have a rhythm together that feels familiar. So that I think that's the great benefit of having a regular partner, that you have a sort of comfort and support as you then take your improvisation before an audience, which is like this new variable to deal with.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, that's great. I mean, I of course have similar experiences of dancing with people, and certainly sometimes I've been at contact improvisation jams, and you go and you end up dancing with someone and you have a great dance, and you've like shared weight and rolled on one another and pushed against each other and like sunk into one another, and you're at the end of the dance, you're like, oh, what's your name? You just had this like really like intense physical kind of experience with one another, and it's it's just a different way of knowing the person, right? So, and then of course having danced with some people for literally decades and understanding all their little quirks and being able to like enjoy them and play with them, right?
Yeah.
Great. So I want to kind of like go ahead and kind of like shift gears, because now a lot of this, in your book you talk about translating a lot of these experiences into these other realms with people, working as a coach and a consultant and stuff. And I'm excited because I've never had anyone on the podcast who has a book that I can be like, hey,
Yay.
you can find out more about Sharna and her work and buy this book. And as I mentioned to you, I just got it a couple of days ago, so I haven't been able to read a lot of it yet, but I have started reading it, and I really appreciate kind of the relationship between leader and follower, leadership and followership, and this idea. And for many of us who work in organizations where we have multiple roles, and just to be able to recognize those roles in a really tangible way and the responsibilities with those roles is super helpful. And you've kind of named them really lovely. And I don't like, maybe just to start off, like you could just talk a little bit about how you see these two roles and their relationship.
Yeah, sure. My main inspiration for writing this book was just noticing as I worked with people in office and various professional environments, and just being aware, okay, outside dance, it's all about leadership, right? The word follower is like it's either a negative or it doesn't exist. And and at the same time, there's this big blind spot. There's sort of a lot of still mystery in the working world around, like, why are we losing people, or why aren't they happy? Why aren't they engaged? And so I just felt like the dance world had so much wisdom to offer in naming followership as this complementary mode of being, right, with leadership. So often in an organization, there's just only one way to be good at something, is by being a leader. And that just seemed like silly to me. Like, what about everybody else? Like they're doing stuff too. Right. So the way I think of those roles in a work environment or in a team environment is not so different than I think of them in dance. So you have the leader, obviously, and we're used to that. But then for everything the leader is doing for the team or for the other people, there's something also being done in exchange, right? In reflection. So if your leader is like communicating out, the plan for the week, then at minimum, right, your team members are like receiving that communication. They're going to interpret it in a certain way. They're going to remember it, or they're going to not pay attention. So like something needs to happen on the other side of that for there to be success, right? And that side is, in my mind, equally as vital as whatever the leader is doing. And so I sought to kind of, from that base level of like communicating and understanding, I sought to then make that follower side, right, even more complex, right, based on my experience with Tango and trying to name what else are those people doing while the leader is doing what they're doing.
Yeah, it's really great. And you kind of divide this up into kind of three kind of subcategories of connect, collaboration, and co-create. And then in each of those, there's kind of these attributes and stuff like that. And I wonder, like, maybe is there one or two of these kind of attribute pairs that you could highlight for us? Maybe ones that particularly evolved out of the dance, or not, which is two that maybe strike you? I don't know.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll talk about a pair that tends to be, I wouldn't say the word popular, but it tends to catch a lot of attention. And that is, it's in the collaborate section. And collaboration I see as sort of the everyday nuts and bolts of work. It's like how your stuff fits with other people's stuff, and like the routine timelines, and, like the mechanics of getting things done, just like the mechanics of, dancing around the floor. You need to have a shared vocabulary, see how your bodies fit together, all that stuff. And so the pair that jumps out in that section for a lot of people is expectations and boundaries.
Mm.
And I'll just say briefly what I mean by those words because I'm using them specifically. So the expectations I put on the leader side, and these would be things like, they could be like codes of conduct, or they could be like, here's what I expect everyone to get done by the end of the week. They're like the big picture overview of the team. Like what am I putting out there for everyone to agree on? Parameters or variables or behaviors or, other expectations.
Yeah.
And then the boundaries are like how the people who are impacted by that respond to those expectations, right? So, and a boundary is something that keeps you individually safe, right? In this sense. So the follower then says, okay, you're saying you expect me to write these 3 chapters by Friday. Based on the other things I have to do, I'm not going to be able to do that. I can do 2. And so then, the other side of that conversation is informing whoever did, whatever leader set the expectation is like, okay, we need to modify that expectation with this boundary because, or we need to eliminate something else from my workload so that this can take priority. Yeah. And sometimes in an office that's called things like pushback, but I'm not crazy about that term because really it's just they're both serving the same end. Like we both want a stable work environment, we both want healthy outcomes, and so the boundary side is like modifying in a sense the expectation so that it's realistic. Yeah. And a boundary could be also an ethical one. It could be like, this is not right. I'm going to take a stand here. I'm going to make sure we don't go down this path, right, which isn't safe or isn't moral. So that's how I see it, like a dialogue.
Yeah, it's great. I love because it is about like all these roles, both these roles have their like responsibilities to the whole, and it's not that one is subservient to the other. They just have excuse me, they just have different kind of avenues within the organization or within whatever. I mean, as I was reading these, I was like, oh, this could apply to a marriage. This could apply to your relationship to your kid, right? I have a 14-year-old daughter who is very much coming into herself, and the idea of leader and follower is definitely at times changing. Right, that she's leading the situation, and then I'm following her lead, and so, and also this idea that the roles that you may have will vary depending on the context all the time, right? Even with the same person, right?
Yeah, I would give a credit to Barbara Kellerman, who's another leadership and followership scholar, and she's often credited with that triangle: leader, follower, and context, right, as a way of determining what the role should be.
Yeah. One of the other ones that I thought, one of the other kind of like sets or pairs that I thought was really interesting was imagination and bravery. Because again, for me I exist in this huge bureaucracy now because I'm at a university, and it's a whole statewide university system. So it's just layers and layers of paperwork, basically.
Lovely.
But as an artist, like those two words, those two ideas are really important, but in this context, they're really interesting. So I don't know, maybe you could say a couple words about those two and how they fit into this kind of framework.
Yeah. And I would also just throw out there that I think sometimes we all do both of these, right? There's a sense in which we lead and follow ourselves, again, depending on the context or the scope, of the work. So you might feel like, well, I do both of those things. And yes, I would agree. We probably do, and sometimes you do them inside and sometimes you do them with other people. So yeah, imagination I put on the leader side. And again, all those leader things, when I'm characterizing the leader mind or the leader role, I'm thinking of things that look outward and think of like whole teams or whole organizations or like larger visions. And so imagination is the skill of being able to imagine something in the future that doesn't exist yet. Like, well, what if we could do this? Maybe it can be this way. Or, I see our organization growing into a new industry next year or next 5 years, or I imagine us creating this new product, or I imagine us offering 6 new courses next year. So that sort of imagination is like what could be. And then obviously you need people to fulfill that with you, right? You're not going to do it by yourself. And so the following side of that is like, all right, how might that happen? What part of that could we do next? What makes sense for, me, team member A, to tackle? What makes sense for team member B to research? And so the bravery is like, whoa, that doesn't exist yet. But, just like on the dance floor, my leader's like, step over here. I'm like, well, I don't know what's going to happen over there, but I'm going to go anyway, because, I trust that your vision is going to lead us somewhere. And so that's bravery. It's like, well, we've never taught that course before, but I'm going to put it together anyway. I'm going to give it, use all my resources and see where it takes me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. It's really interesting, just these ideas around leadership and fellowship, and how, I can so easily imagine them in so many roles in my life, from an artist to kind of an administrator to, part of a family, to part of a community, a larger community, right?
Yeah.
And how, even though sometimes we see frameworks like these, and you have it laid out really clearly, and there's relationships in this, knowing that it's like much messier, and that we're all kind of, again, I'm just going to bring it back, we're improvising within this structure, right? We have this structure of leading and following, but we're all kind of navigating through it as an improvisation, and grabbing and using what we need right now, and then moving on to something else as it becomes necessary.
Yes, totally agree. Yeah, I would never want people to receive this book as a kind of formula, right? But more as like a scaffolding or framework, a guide. And the point is not the structure, right? The point is what comes out of your engagement with the structure.
Right. Yeah, there's a great quote, I'm going to just paraphrase it, of like, when you, I don't know, it was labeled as some like kind of Zen quote or something, I don't know if it really is, but once you have the fish, you can forget about the fishing pole, and kind of once you have the rabbit, you can forget about the snare, and once you have the meaning, you can forget about the words.
Nice.
And these structures offer us a way of understanding the thing, and then we transcend it, or when we can fully embody it, that is when like the real dance happens, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I kind of laid it out this way just for that reason. It's like to just give some structure is the word that's coming to mind, but like how do we get into this improvisation, right? Yeah. We need to kind of give a couple of parameters, like writing a score, okay, you can stay on this side of the stage and, do like 3 things at a time, something.
Right.
So it's kind of like a score, because again, what I've noticed so much in organizations is that there's so much stigma on following and so much centrism around leading, is that it's just hard to get there any other way. Like you can't like go to the end from zero, right? And so as a way of getting people there, right, to the creative dialogue, it's like, well, what would be like some step 1 and 2? And then once you're kind of on the way, you can improvise your partnerships. But if you're already confused, right, about like why you're not engaged or why you don't feel connected, then you need to kind of go back to those basic steps.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the first quote, or the quote that I read about like improvising isn't winging it.
Right.
It's knowing the material, excuse me, knowing the elements, knowing the framework, knowing the structure of the thing. And if you get lost at any point, you can always go back to those ideas or those elements that support the thing, right? You know, if you're dancing, if I'm dancing improvisationally, I can always check in with space and time and, you know, movement vocabulary to like reground myself. And, you know, just like you can go back to listening to music or the touch or the weight or the more simple elements to then keep branching out. So it's like this, you know, infinity loop of going back and forth.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. Yeah, I get, you know, and I know that word follower in the organizational sense isn't popular, but you know, what happens is people resist that and they're like, well, we just don't want to use the word. We don't want to think about leader and follower. But, you know, when you don't acknowledge it, you're just stuck, you know, like then you can't build because you don't have those foundational tools yet. So if you start there and recognize, okay, well, you know, if you're, you know, with your team, like that's actually like 5 different individuals you're in partnership with, you know, and each of them, you know, are different and each of them like have influence as well as you. And so some of those basic, you know, tools of like connecting and just recognizing how your actions are interconnected.
Yeah.
Once that starts to make sense, then, you know, I don't really ultimately care if you use the word follower, but like there has to be an awareness of that interconnection and how people do influence one another in order to get the outcomes we want, right? In order to get like sustainability, right? And inclusion and, you know, balanced workloads and people feeling that they have meaning in their work. Like if we want those outcomes, I think this is one way to get there.
Yeah. And I mean, as you're talking and kind of describing it, and it's also not thinking of it as like a limitation or like almost not even a noun, but thinking of it as a verb. I'm following right now. I'm not like a follower, like, so poor me, I'm a follower. like just right now you're following, you know, the leading of someone else, and that can change. Anyway,
I love the verb, the verbs. Yeah,
it's really helpful. Well, thank you so much for taking time today to talk about all of those things, and you know, it's so great to see how all of these kind of themes kind of weave through in so many ways, and you've kind of manifested these things in so many ways in your life and in the world. And it was great to kind of just hear you talk about it more. So I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Well, I really appreciate your questions. You know, it's a great, I think, example of leading and following, you know, the interview. And I always appreciate a great partner.
Yeah. Have a wonderful rest of your day, Sharna.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Sharna. I absolutely love hearing about her experience within the world of tango and how she's taking that experience and kind of translating it into such different realms. If you want to find out more about Sharna, check out the links in the show notes. There's links to her stuff and some other things that we talked about, so you can just kind of find your way and find other ways to find out what she's doing and her work, which is really quite wonderful, I think. If you haven't, please subscribe to Act React. You can find us on YouTube, Apple, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, and even on Vimeo. So we're kind of all over the place, but subscribe so you can check out older episodes and hear the new episodes as they come available. We've got a number of new episodes coming up over the next couple of weeks, which again, I'm also very excited about. So until then, please take care, be well, and live spontaneously.